When one imagines a psychologist, they may bring forth images of an old man in a lab coat, injecting rats with drugs maybe. We envision a therapist listening to your problems and doodling indiscretion on a clipboard. Perhaps we even recall a certain sex-obsessed founder of psychoanalysis. All of these icons of psychologically become obscured under the shadow of a psychologist who loved alchemy, listened closely to the ramblings of schizophrenic patients, studied science and the paranormal, developed dance and movement therapy, and when he began to experience a psychotic breakdown, that will last years used it as an opportunity to study the inner workings of his subconscious. Carl Jung was born childhood in July 1875 in a small Swiss hamlet by a lake. Jung's mother was the daughter of an eccentric theologian who had conversations with the dead. His other grandfather was a respected physician. This clash of mysticism with the physical sciences would be a central theme in Jung's life. Jung was a eunuch. At a young age, Carl kept a small mannequin in the attic, and from time to time would present the figure with scrolls filled with a secret language yet he had developed. He would also sit atop a stone in his garden and play a game of projection. At first he would state, "I am sitting on top of this stone and it is underneath." Secondly, he would state that I am lying here on this slope and he is sitting on top of me. Then Jung would ask whether or not he was the stone or Carl. This would later reflect his fascination with alchemy, as alchemists would project the contents of their own psyches into their work. Jung also regularly fantasized about living in a citadel that would shield him from the world and his imagined structure. Jung found his two personalities, number 1 and number 2. Number 1 was the son of his parents, the student of his school, and the young boy at church. He was the societal young. Number 2 was less easy to describe. Second personality was older and live with animals and nature. It was the entire vision of life itself. Later he will name these two personalities faintly, number 1 being the ego and number 2 being the self. At school, Jung would regularly faint so he could avoid going. He had felt quite isolated amongst his peers. However, one day he had heard of his father speaking of his anxiety over his son's future. Jung quickly cured his fainting and read every piece of literature, philosophy and religious text he could get his hands on during his student years, where he found himself so ahead of his peers that he was at times falsely accused of plagiarism. Jung had a peculiar dream in which he was walking through a dense fog at night. He held in his hand a glowing light, and behind appeared a large dark shadow that was chasing him. I realized at once that the figure was my own shadow on the swirling mists brought into being by the little light I was carrying. I knew too that this little light was my consciousness, the only light I have. My own understanding is the sole treasure I possess. And the great test as Jung progressed in his studies. He began to record and attend seances. Jung was compelled by the seemingly real presence of ghosts, and how he could speak to them and touch them as if they were anybody else. In these experiences, Jung came to two main ideas in practicing analytical psychology. For one, he concluded that partial personalities rise in the unconscious psyche and can brought forth through dreams or scenes. Secondly, he proposed that the development of personality occurs almost entirely unconsciously. Jung then chose psychiatry. After dabbling at a possible career as an archaeologist, he came under the apprenticeship of Eugene Boer, while would later come up with the term schizophrenia. As Jung rose to prominence, he became acquainted with Freud, who would spend his career predicting the current trend in adulthood. Upon their first meeting, Freud and Jung supposedly talked for 13 hours straight. Freud thought of Jung as his successor, and his enthusiasm only furthered this assumption. However, aside from their weird preoccupation with figuring out what's going on in people's minds that they're not even aware of, that have their differences, Freud believed that human motivation was always pointed towards doing something dirty, and that the unconscious was entirely unique and separate between people. Jung believed that human motivation was way more complex, and argued that there was a collective unconscious instead, shared across many individuals. Eventually they split, with Jung sending a letter to Freud that quoted Nietzsche's Zarathustra: "One repays 80 badly if one remains only a pupil after this breakup." Jung explored the terrifying abyss of his subconscious, starting with a horrifying vision in which all of Europe was consumed in blood, and followed by a dream in which killed Siegfried in an icy hellscape. Jung would hear voices in his head, would find his house to be entirely occupied by the spirits of the dead, and would frolic in his garden like a child. The Red Book. Like any reasonable person, Jung decided not to seek institutional help, and instead saw his departure into the abyss as an ample opportunity for resurgence. From 1913 to 1918, the peak years of what has been called his creative lens, Jung illustrated and wrote the Red Book, capturing his momentous journey into darkness. The book was only recently released in 2009. Due to its controversial nature, it recounts Jung traveling through the land of the dead, conversing with an old man with wings, and finally visiting Liverpool, despite seemingly unscientific aspect of such a work. Jung's experience is similar to the events in the lives of other thinkers who have taken on a time of intense intellectual activity and theorists such as Nietzsche, Freud, and Van Gogh. After this creative illness, Jung became obsessed with the transformation and achievement of personality, otherwise called individuation. It is at this point where Jung began to synthesize his complex theory of psychology and philosophy. One of Jung's main theory assertions relays around archetypes. Archetypes are identical physical structures commando all when organized together. They form the archaic heritage of humanity. They are innate neuropsychic centers that can influence our behavior and experience, and give rise to thoughts, feelings, and ideas that shape our personality and existence. Jung believes that learning about archetypes can only be achieved through close analysis of universal myths, symbols, and images. For example, the trickster is considered to be a universal archetype. It occurs in almost every culture as a motif, as a figure that navigates the dangers of the world through mischief and deceit. Jung points to motifs such as these that occur across cultures to show that certain symbols must exist universally as innate pictures in our unconscious. Hence, Jung believed that the composition of every psyche in the world would result in the collective unconscious, the structures of the unconscious mind shared by members of the same species. For humans, that stuff like the aforementioned instances, the mother figure, the hero, and the wise old man. Here's a diagram of Jung's model of the psyche. The totality of all psychic processes on the outside who have the consciousness, the stuff we're aware of, the ego, is situated within here, the central field of consciousness that gives us a sense of identity. It orbits the psyche like a planet. This is quite similar to the number one personality of his childhood. Fern, we have the personal unconscious, the link between the conscious and collective unconscious area has complexes made up of personifications of archetypes, making the collective personal. It develops a Sony's own personal growth, coincides with archetypes. The very middle is the self, totality of the entire psyche, with all potentialities included. The self contains the ambition to grow and develop to become itself. How does one come oneself? Jung saw the actualization of archetypes, most notably mother figure, to be necessary in such a process, that is, as the person grows, their environment unlocks the archetypes to become active. It should be, how does one become oneself? Noted, if this sounds far-fetched, theology, the study of animal behavior in nature has somewhat replicated this theory. Animals have a certain set of behaviors that depend on neurological structures developed throughout evolution. These structures are innate releasing machines that become active when they confront a certain environmental property or sign stimulus. Organisms respond with a certain behavioral pattern to the situation. One sees innate releasing machine is active. Hence, Jung saw archetypes as an inherited mode of functioning. Even though we vary in how we fall in love or mourn and create art, the universality of the acts themselves denote some set of shared structures found across our species. Another important piece of Jung's thinking is that of the stage of life. Archetypes regulate the life cycle revolving around the self-roles we play in these cycles. Are crucial to understand such things as the ego, the persona, and the shadow, as mentioned before. The total realization of The self is the entire goal of psychological life. He calls this process individuation. This in sum means integrating the conscious with the unconscious, unifying them all would be the equivalent of maximizing one's human potential. But first we have to go through some stages, starting with ego. The ego develops in childhood as the center of consciousness. Although we use the term I to reference the ego, it really just plays the role of the self's manager. It's created by the self to stay organized and keep things running relatively smoothly by keeping up appearances. This is important early on. The idea that we have a consistent identity keeps us from experiencing this. These appearances made by the ego are developed through the persona mask we put on, or the role we play when in social environments. Especially nowadays in the era of social media, the persona strives to display or highlight real, even to the detriment of our identities. 1.